In the rigid hierarchy of ancient Kerala, few families held more spiritual authority than the Azhvanchery Thamprakkal. He was the intellectual summit of his society. Working in the mud beneath him was his servant, Mangalathu Sankaran, a man who lived with a literal, animalistic simplicity. The Thamprakal's wealth was measured in a massive, chaotic herd of sacred cows. It was Sankaran's job to control hundreds of these animals single-handedly. When the cattle refused to move, Sankaran didn't use complex commands. He found a specific pressure point on their bodies and struck them there. One hit with his staff, and the animal dropped dead instantly. He wasn't acting out of cruelty. Sankaran simply didn't possess a human concept of morality. He saw a problem, an unruly animal, and applied a terminal solution. To him, the spiritual weight of the act didn't exist. The Thamprakkal eventually went to inspect his herd, only to find the stalls empty and his sacred animals dead. In his world, the cow is the ultimate symbol of divinity. Seeing them slaughtered was a catastrophe that fundamentally threatened his family's standing. The master confronted Sankaran with a concept the servant had never heard of, papa, or sin. He described a terrifying hellscape where those who harm the sacred cows are punished for eternity. Terrified by this new reality, Sankaran begged for a way out. The Thamprakkal gave him one: walk thousands of miles to the holy city of Kashi and bathe in the Ganges. The intellectual master had successfully anchored the weight of religious guilt onto his servant. Sankaran, now convinced his soul was in peril, began a desperate pilgrimage to the north. Sankaran traveled from the quiet, palm-lined canals of the south to the overwhelming, crowded ritual space of Varanasi. He arrived with a single objective. Following his master's exact orders, he waded through the throngs of pilgrims and plunged into the water. But as he bathed, a cosmic test was forming on the bank. Lord Shiva and the goddess Parvati had arrived, disguised as an elderly Brahmin couple. As the elderly man stepped toward the river, he slipped. He was swept into the current, struggling to stay above the surface as his wife screamed for help. This was a calculated trap. The gods were using this staged crisis to filter the thousands of pilgrims gathered at the river's edge. The disguised Parvati issued a warning to the crowd. Anyone who touched her husband must be completely free of sin. If even a trace of papa remained in the rescuer, the old man would die the moment they touched him. The crowd was full of scholars and priests who spent their lives studying purity, but their knowledge worked against them. They began to overanalyze every minor flaw and forgotten mistake in their own lives, leaving them frozen on the shore. While scholars were lost in a maze of self-evaluation, Sankaran's logic was a straight line. His master said the water washes away sin. He had just bathed, therefore he was pure. Without hesitation, he pushed through the crowd and dove in. For Sankaran, the spiritual world was as literal as the physical in their true forms, stunning the crowd. Shiva declared that of the thousands present, only the cowherd possessed the faith required to act. In that moment, Sankaran was granted moksha, complete liberation from the cycle of rebirth. The man who began this journey as a killer of cows departed as a liberated soul. He had bypassed the scholars not by knowing more, but by believing more. Back in Kerala, the story takes a darker turn. While the servant reached heaven, the Thamprakal's household was facing a sudden collapse in its wealth and lineage. The family consulted the master astrologers of Padipura to find the cause. The revelation was clear. As the owner of the estate, the Thamprakkal held a significant karmic share in the deaths of those cows. He had outsourced the physical act of penance to his servant, but he could not outsource the responsibility. Sankaran had washed his own share away, but the master was still tethered to the original debt. The family was forced to perform a costly, permanent ritual of feeding cows and banned themselves from ever raising cattle again. These rules remain part of the family's tradition to this day. The scholars at the river were held back by what they knew, but the master in Kerala was held back by what he failed to personally account for. In the end, the servant walked away free because he jumped in, while the master remained bound by a debt he thought he could simply delegate.